February 15, 1944. Commander Yoshio Yamamoto stared at his intelligence maps from inside Japan's impregnable Rabaul fortress, watching American bombers fly directly overhead without attacking. 100,000 Japanese troops, massive underground bunkers, multiple airfields. The Americans just ignored them completely. While Yamamoto's men slowly starved on their bypassed island, those same American forces were building air bases 500 miles closer to Tokyo. In just 18 months, the US had hopscotched across the entire Pacific, turning Japan's strongest defensive positions into irrelevant prison islands. After the war ended, Japanese officers called the American island-hopping strategy brilliant because it gained the most while losing the least. But here's what they never publicly admitted about why their own military doctrine failed so catastrophically. What did the Americans understand about warfare that the Japanese completely missed? And how did this one strategic insight change the rules of combat forever?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rabaul's concrete bunkers on February 10, 1943. Commander Yoshio Yamamoto stood on the observation deck of the intelligence center, breathing in the humid tropical air mixed with diesel fumes from the airfield below. The fortress spread out before him like a small city carved into the volcanic landscape of New Britain Island. 100,000 Japanese soldiers called this place home. They had good reason to feel safe. Rabaul was supposed to be impossible to defeat. The harbor could hold an entire fleet. 5 airfields dotted the area, each one protected by anti-aircraft guns that pointed toward the sky like metal fingers. Underground tunnels connected bunkers that went 3 stories deep into the rock. Food stores could feed the garrison for 6 months. Ammunition dumps held enough shells to fight for a year. The soldiers called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and they meant it. Japan's empire stretched farther than any in history. From the frozen Aleutian Islands near Alaska to the steamy jungles of the Solomon Islands, the rising sun flag flew over millions of square miles of ocean and land. Every morning, Yamamoto looked at the huge map on his office wall and felt proud. Red pins marked Japanese bases from Wake Island to Singapore. Blue pins showed where American forces were stuck, unable to move forward. The war was going exactly as planned. Japanese leaders in Tokyo had spent years thinking about how to fight America. They knew the Americans would come. They knew the Americans would want to take back the Philippines, recapture Wake Island, and push toward Japan itself. The answer was simple: build walls. Make every island into a fortress. Force the Americans to attack head-on, where Japanese soldiers would fight to the death. Make every mile cost so much blood that America would give up and ask for peace. This was the way wars were supposed to work. You built strong points and held them. You made the enemy come to you. You used every advantage the land could give. The Pacific Ocean was on Japan's side, they believed. All those thousands of miles of water would slow down American ships and planes. All those scattered islands would force the Americans to attack one at a time, losing men and supplies with each battle. Yamamoto understood this strategy perfectly. He had studied at the Naval War College in Tokyo. He had read every book about fortress warfare. He knew that throughout history, the side with the better defensive positions usually won. Castle walls stopped armies. Mountain passes stopped invasions. Islands surrounded by the ocean were even better than castles. The daily routine at Rabaul proved the strategy was working. Every morning at 6 o'clock, reconnaissance planes took off to scout for American ships. Radio operators listened for enemy messages. Code breakers tried to figure out American plans. Patrol boats checked the waters around the island. Everything was organized, everything was ready. Yamamoto's job was to watch and understand what the Americans were doing. His office walls were covered with charts showing American ship movements, plane sightings, and radio intercepts. He knew where every American aircraft carrier was supposed to be. He tracked American bomber squadrons as they moved from base to base. He studied captured American equipment to learn about their weapons and tactics. The intelligence picture looked good for Japan. American forces seemed confused and scattered. They had tried to attack Wake Island and failed. They had managed to hold on to a few small islands in the South Pacific, but they could not push forward. Every time they tried to advance, Japanese planes and ships hit them hard. The Americans were stuck, just as the war planners in Tokyo had predicted. Life inside the fortress felt secure and comfortable. Officers lived in concrete quarters that stayed cool even in the tropical heat. The mess halls served rice, fish, and vegetables grown in gardens around the base. Movies from Japan arrived on supply ships. Letters from home came regularly. Men played cards and wrote in diaries during their off-duty hours. Some learned English from captured American magazines, joking about the strange customs they read about. The soldiers believed completely in their mission. They had sworn to die before surrendering. They practiced rifle drills and bayonet fighting every day. They cleaned their weapons until they gleamed. They built their bunkers stronger and deeper. They planted gardens and raised chickens to make the base more self-sufficient. This island fortress would hold forever, they promised each other. But on the morning of February 15th, something changed. Yamamoto was studying intelligence reports when his assistant burst into the office. "Enemy planes approaching from the southeast," he announced. "Lots of them, more than usual." Yamamoto climbed to the observation deck and raised his binoculars. The sky to the southeast was full of black dots. B-24 Liberator bombers flying in perfect formation. He counted them quickly, 50 planes, then 70, then more than 100. The largest American air raid anyone at Rabaul had ever seen. Air raid sirens began to wail across the base. Soldiers ran to their positions. Anti-aircraft guns swung toward the approaching bombers. Everyone knew what to do. They had practiced this drill dozens of times. The Americans were finally going to smash Rabaul with bombs, just like everyone expected. Yamamoto watched through his binoculars. The bombers were flying at 20,000 feet, too high for most of the anti-aircraft guns to reach effectively. Their formation was tight and disciplined. These were not the confused, scattered Americans his intelligence reports described. These pilots knew exactly what they were doing. But then something strange happened. The bombers did not turn toward Rabaul. They flew directly overhead, staying in their tight formation. The anti-aircraft guns fired anyway, sending black puffs of smoke into the sky, but the planes were already past the harbor and continuing northwest. Yamamoto tracked them with his binoculars until they disappeared over the horizon. Where were they going? There was nothing northwest of Rabaul except the ocean and a few small islands that barely showed up on the maps. No Japanese bases worth bombing. No strategic targets that made any sense. Why would the Americans send their biggest bombing raid of the war to attack empty water and coral reefs?
The radio room provided the answer 3 hours later. The bombers had attacked Wewak, a small airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea. Not a major base like Rabaul, not a fortress with huge guns and thick walls, just a simple airstrip with a few dozen planes and 1,000 men. Why waste all those bombers on such a small target when the real prize was right here? That evening, Yamamoto sat in his quarters trying to make sense of what he had seen. He opened his personal journal and began to write. The Americans had flown more than 100 bombers directly over our strongest fortress without dropping a single bomb. They ignored 100,000 defenders to attack 1,000. This does not match any textbook on warfare that I have ever read. Something was wrong with his understanding of American strategy, or something was wrong with American strategy itself. Either way, the war was not going according to plan. The great fortress of Rabaul had been treated like it did not exist. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Commander Yoshio Yamamoto felt a small, cold fear growing in his chest. Outside his window, the tropical night was full of the usual sounds. Waves lapping against the harbor walls, generators humming in the bunkers, guards calling to each other from their posts. Everything seemed normal and safe. But Yamamoto could not shake the image of those bombers flying overhead like they owned the sky, heading toward targets that made no sense at all. What did the Americans know that he did not? 3 weeks after the strange bombing raid, Yamamoto's confusion turned into something much worse. The morning intelligence briefing on March 8, 1943, brought news that made no sense at all. American forces had landed on a tiny island called Tarawa, more than 800 miles southeast of Rabaul. The island was so small it barely showed up on most maps. Why would the Americans waste thousands of soldiers on a speck of coral in the middle of nowhere? Lieutenant Sato spread the reconnaissance photos across Yamamoto's desk. The images showed American landing craft hitting the beaches while Marines waded through shallow water under heavy fire. Bodies floated in the lagoon. Burned-out tanks sat on the sand. The fighting had been brutal and bloody. More than 3,000 Americans had died or been wounded, taking an island that was only 2 miles long and half a mile wide. But the Americans kept coming anyway. Wave after wave of landing craft brought more Marines ashore. Bulldozers arrived to clear the beaches. Engineering units began building an airfield before the shooting even stopped. Within a week of landing, American transport planes were using the new runway. Within 2 weeks, bombers were taking off to hit targets even farther away. Yamamoto studied the photos until his eyes hurt. The Americans had spent more men taking Tarawa than Japan had defending it. They had used more ships, more planes, and more supplies than seemed reasonable for such a tiny piece of land. But somehow they had made it work. The island that took them 4 days to capture was already becoming a base for the next attack. Where would that attack come? Yamamoto traced his finger across the map, following the chain of islands that stretched across the Central Pacific. If the Americans were serious about this strange strategy, they would probably hit the Marshall Islands next. But the Marshalls were heavily defended. Admiral Yamada had 20,000 troops spread across the major atolls. Concrete bunkers protected every landing beach. Artillery covered every approach. The Americans would lose 10,000 men trying to take the Marshalls, maybe more. The answer came sooner than expected. On February 1, 1944, American battleships appeared off Kwajalein Atoll in the heart of the Marshall Islands. For 3 days, the big guns pounded Japanese positions with shells that weighed as much as small cars. Then the Marines landed, supported by more naval gunfire than had ever been used in one battle before. But this time, the Americans had learned something new. Instead of attacking all the defended islands in the Marshalls, they focused on just 2, Kwajalein and Majuro. They ignored the other fortified positions completely, leaving thousands of Japanese soldiers sitting in their bunkers with no enemy to fight. Within a week, American engineers were building new airfields on both captured islands, while Japanese forces on nearby atolls watched helplessly from just a few miles away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Yamamoto received the final casualty reports with growing disbelief. The Americans had lost fewer than 400 men taking the marshals. The Japanese had lost more than 8,000. But the numbers that really shocked him were the ones about supplies and equipment. American ships had unloaded enough concrete to build a small city. Prefabricated buildings arrived on cargo vessels and were assembled in days instead of months. Bulldozers, trucks, and generators came ashore in an endless stream. The radio intercepts told an even stranger story. American soldiers on the captured islands were eating fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit shipped in from bases thousands of miles away. Ice cream machines worked day and night to keep up with demand. Coca-Cola trucks drove around the new bases delivering cold drinks to construction workers. Men who had been fighting in the jungle just days before were sleeping in air-conditioned barracks and watching movies in theaters with real seats. Meanwhile, at Rabaul, the food situation was getting worse every week. Supply ships from Japan came less often now. Rice rations had been cut twice since the new year. Fresh vegetables came from the base gardens when they grew at all. The men joked about American luxury, but Yamamoto could see the worry in their eyes. How could an enemy afford to ship ice cream across 8,000 miles of ocean when Japan could barely keep its forward bases supplied with rice? The intelligence reports from other parts of the Pacific made the pattern even clearer. In the Admiralty Islands, American forces had bypassed the main Japanese base and captured a lightly defended anchorage instead. In New Guinea, they had leapfrogged over strongly fortified positions to land at places that barely had names on the maps. Each captured position became a stepping stone to the next advance, with new airfields and supply dumps appearing faster than Japanese commanders could track them. Yamamoto began marking the American advances on his wall map with black pins. The pattern looked like someone jumping across stepping stones in a river. Each captured island brought American bombers closer to the next target. Each new airfield extended the range of American fighters. The advancing line of black pins curved around Japanese strongholds like water flowing around rocks, always finding the path of least resistance. The most shocking report came in June. American forces had invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands, only 1,400 miles from Tokyo itself. Saipan was supposed to be part of Japan's inner defense ring, the line that could never be crossed. 30,000 Japanese defenders had sworn to fight to the death rather than let the enemy pass. But the Americans came with overwhelming force, more than 150,000 troops supported by 15 aircraft carriers and 7 battleships. The radio messages from Saipan grew more desperate each day. Artillery fired day and night without stopping. B-24 bombers attacked in formations of 50 or more planes. Naval gunfire turned concrete bunkers into gravel. Japanese counterattacks met walls of machine gun fire and flamethrowers. After 3 weeks of fighting, Saipan fell. Only a few thousand Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. But the real shock came with the intelligence reports about what the Americans did next. Within 30 days of capturing Saipan, construction crews had built the largest bomber base in the Pacific. Runways long enough for B-29 superfortresses stretched across the island like concrete highways. Fuel farms held millions of gallons of aviation gas. Warehouses stored enough bombs to level a dozen cities. Yamamoto stood before his wall map on July 15, 1944, counting the black pins that marked American positions. In 18 months, they had advanced more than 3,000 miles across the Pacific. They had captured dozens of islands and built dozens of new bases. Each advance brought them closer to Japan, while leaving thousands of Japanese soldiers stranded on bypassed islands with no hope of relief or resupply. The mathematics were becoming clear and terrifying. American industrial power could build new bases faster than Japan could defend against them. American logistics could supply forward positions that Japanese submarines could no longer reach. American air power could protect advancing forces while isolating Japanese garrisons.
The fortress strategy that had seemed so smart in 1942 was becoming a trap in 1944. Late at night, alone in his quarters, Yamamoto wrote in his journal with growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in the nature of warfare itself. The Americans were not fighting to hold ground the way armies had always fought. They were fighting to advance their range, to extend their reach, to bring their power closer to targets that really mattered. Every captured island was not an end in itself, but a means to capture the next island, and the next, and the next. The fortress of Rabaul felt smaller every day. Supply ships came rarely now. The food was short, ammunition was running low. Mail from home arrived weeks late, if it arrived at all. 100,000 Japanese soldiers sat in their concrete bunkers watching American bombers fly overhead towards targets they could only guess at, waiting for an attack that might never come because the enemy had already moved on to more important battles. What kind of war was this, where the strongest positions became prisons and the weakest points became stepping stones to victory? The moment everything changed came at 3 o'clock in the morning on November 24, 1944. Yamamoto woke to the sound of air raid sirens wailing across Tokyo, 800 miles away from his bunker at Rabaul. But he could hear them anyway because Lieutenant Sato was shaking him awake with a radio message that would shatter everything he thought he understood about war. B-29 superfortresses were bombing the Japanese capital. Not just 1 or 2 planes on a raid that would barely matter. 111 giant bombers were dropping firebombs on the aircraft factories that built Japanese fighters. The same factories where Yamamoto's younger brother worked the night shift. The same city where his parents lived in a wooden house just 3 miles from the Imperial Palace. Yamamoto sat up in his narrow bunk trying to make sense of what Sato was telling him. American bombers attacking Tokyo meant they had to be flying from somewhere close enough to reach the city and return safely. The closest American bases were supposed to be in China, more than 1,500 miles away. B-29s were big planes, but they couldn't fly 3,000 miles and carry enough bombs to matter. The answer hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The bombers were taking off from Saipan. The island the Americans had captured 5 months ago was now launching the largest air raid in history against the heart of Japan itself. Those runways that American engineers had built in 30 days were bringing the war home to people who had never seen an enemy plane before. Yamamoto walked to his wall map and stared at the black pins marking American positions. Saipan was only 1,400 miles from Tokyo. B-29s could fly that distance easily, drop tons of bombs, and return with fuel to spare. From his concrete bunker on an island that no longer mattered to anyone, he could see the entire American strategy spread out like a path of stepping stones leading straight to Japan.
The radio reports from Tokyo continued through the morning. Factories burning out of control, neighborhoods evacuated. Hundreds of people were killed or wounded. Fire trucks racing through streets filled with smoke and falling ash. Air raid shelters packed with families who had never expected the war to reach them. And more bombers are coming every day, taking off from islands that had been Japanese territory just months before. For the next week, Yamamoto could not eat or sleep properly. Every meal tasted like sawdust. Every night brought dreams of B-29s flying over his childhood home. He walked the perimeter of Rabaul like a man in a trance, looking at the concrete bunkers and artillery positions that had seemed so important just a year ago. Now they felt like monuments to a kind of thinking that no longer worked. The intelligence reports that arrived each day made the picture clearer and more terrible. American bombers were hitting Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama on a schedule as regular as train departures. Japanese fighter planes rose to meet them but could not climb high enough or fly fast enough to stop the raids. Anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells but barely scratched the flying fortresses that cruised above the clouds like metal gods.
Yamamoto opened his journal and began to write with a hand that shook slightly. We built our strategy on the idea that distance would protect us. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean was supposed to be our ally. Every mile between America and Japan was supposed to make their attacks weaker and our defense stronger. But they have turned distance into a weapon against us. Each captured island brings their power closer while leaving our power trapped in places that no longer matter. The mathematics were simple and brutal. In 1942, American bombers based in China could barely reach the edge of Japan. In 1943, American bombers based in captured islands could hit a few cities on the Japanese coast. In 1944, American bombers based in the Marianas could reach any target in Japan and return safely. The island-hopping campaign had compressed 3,000 miles of ocean into a series of short hops that brought overwhelming firepower to Japan's doorstep. Yamamoto walked to his window and looked out at the harbor where Japanese warships had once gathered before sailing to attack Pearl Harbor. Now the harbor was nearly empty. Most of the fleet was gone, sunk in battles across the Pacific, or trapped in ports without fuel. The few remaining ships could not leave because American submarines controlled the sea lanes. Even if they could sail, where would they go? Every direction led to islands now controlled by American forces. The supply situation at Rabaul was becoming desperate. The last major convoy had arrived in September, and it had been attacked by American planes before the ships could finish unloading. Rice rations were now half of what they had been a year ago. Fresh vegetables existed only in the small gardens that grew between the bunkers. Medicine was running out. Spare parts for equipment no longer arrived. Men were getting sick from diseases that should have been easy to treat. But the Americans on their captured islands were living better than Japanese civilians back home. Radio intercepts revealed construction projects that boggled the mind. On Saipan alone, American engineers had built 6 major runways, each one longer than the biggest airfield in Japan. Fuel storage tanks held more gasoline than some Japanese cities used in a month. Warehouses stored enough bombs to keep the raids going for years. The most shocking intercept came on December 15th. An American radio operator on Tinian, just 3 miles from Saipan, was requesting more ice cream supplies for the base Christmas party. Ice cream, shipped frozen across 8,000 miles of ocean to an island that had been a battlefield 6 months earlier. While Japanese soldiers at Rabaul rationed handfuls of rice, American airmen were worried about having enough dessert for their holiday celebration. Yamamoto sat in his quarters that night, staring at maps and reports until the words blurred together. The Americans were not just winning the war, they were rewriting the rules of how wars could be fought. They had turned the Pacific Ocean from a barrier into a highway. They had transformed scattered islands from defensive positions into offensive platforms. They had made Japan's greatest strength, its island geography, into its greatest weakness. In his journal, he wrote the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We spent our energy building walls. They spent theirs building bridges. We thought in terms of holding ground. They thought in terms of extending range. Every island we fortified became a prison for our soldiers. Every island they captured became a stepping stone toward victory. We prepared to fight the last war while they invented the next one. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on January 9, 1945. Radio Tokyo announced that American forces had landed in the Philippines, at a place called Lingayen Gulf on the island of Luzon. General MacArthur had returned, just as he had promised when Japanese forces drove him out 3 years earlier. But he had not come back the way Japanese planners expected. Instead of fighting his way through every fortified island between Australia and the Philippines, he had leapfrogged across the Pacific using captured airfields as stepping stones. Yamamoto traced MacArthur's path on his wall map. From Australia to New Guinea to the Admiralties to Hollandia to the Philippines. Each jump had bypassed major Japanese strongholds, leaving them cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were still fighting on islands that no longer mattered to the outcome of the war. They were fighting bravely and dying uselessly while the real battle moved on without them. The American strategy was brilliant because it gained the most while losing the least. They avoided Japan's strength and attacked its weakness. They refused to fight where Japanese forces were strongest and instead created new battlefields where American advantages could decide the outcome. They understood that in modern war, mobility mattered more than fortification, logistics mattered more than courage, and industrial power mattered more than fighting spirit. Yamamoto closed his journal and walked to his window one more time. Outside, 100,000 Japanese soldiers continued their daily routines in a fortress that had become irrelevant. They cleaned their weapons, maintained their equipment, and prepared for battles that would never come. They were the best soldiers in the world, trapped in the wrong kind of war, fighting an enemy who had already moved on to more important objectives. What did this mean for Japan? What did this mean for the future of warfare itself? The Americans had proven that in the modern world, the side that could move faster and strike hardest would win, regardless of how strong the defenders' positions might be. They had weaponized distance, turned geography into an ally, and made traditional military thinking obsolete. The war was not over yet, but Yamamoto already knew how it would end. The train pulled into Tokyo Station on October 15, 1946, 14 months after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the radio. Commander Yoshio Yamamoto stepped onto the platform carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag: his war journal, a few photographs, and the clothes on his back. The rest of his possessions had been left behind at Rabaul when American ships finally arrived to take the Japanese garrison home. Tokyo looked like a city made of ghosts and ashes. Where the Imperial Hotel had once stood, only twisted metal beams reached toward the sky like the bones of some enormous dead animal. The neighborhoods where Yamamoto had played as a child were now fields of rubble, broken by the occasional wall or chimney that had somehow survived the bombing. Weeds grew through cracks in roads that led to places that no longer existed. American soldiers directed traffic at major intersections, their uniforms clean and pressed despite the dust that covered everything else. They handed out candy to Japanese children and helped old women carry water buckets from the few working wells. The same men whose bombers had destroyed this city are now feeding their people and rebuilding its bridges. Yamamoto watched them work with the same efficient energy they had shown capturing islands across the Pacific.
The train ride to his family home in the Sumida district took 2 hours instead of the usual 30 minutes. Bomb craters had torn up the tracks in dozens of places. Temporary wooden bridges crossed rivers where steel spans had been melted by incendiary bombs. At every stop, Yamamoto saw more evidence of what American industrial power could accomplish when it set its mind to destruction instead of construction. His parents' house was gone. The entire block was gone. Only the concrete foundation remained, covered by wild grass and small trees that had sprouted from the ashes. Yamamoto stood in the spot where his childhood bedroom had been and tried to remember what the street had looked like before the B-29s came. The bombers that took off from islands he had watched the Americans capture were the ones that had destroyed his family's life. A neighbor woman recognized him and called out from across the rubble field. His parents were safe, she said. They had moved in with relatives in the countryside after the house burned down. His brother had died in the aircraft factory during the first big raid in November 1944. The same raid that Yamamoto had heard about over the radio while sitting in his bunker at Rabaul, 800 miles away from the people he loved. Yamamoto found his parents living in a one-room farmhouse 30 miles outside the city. His father looked 20 years older, his back bent from carrying water and chopping wood. His mother's hands were scarred from working in the fields to grow enough food to survive. They hugged him and cried, but their eyes held something he had never seen before, a mixture of relief and shame that the war was finally over. That evening, sitting around a small charcoal fire, Yamamoto tried to explain what he had learned during 3.5 years of watching the Americans fight their way across the Pacific. His father listened in silence as his son described how the enemy had turned Japan's own strategy against itself, how every fortified island had become a prison, how the vast Pacific Ocean had become a highway for American power. The old man finally spoke after Yamamoto finished talking. "So we were fighting the wrong war from the beginning," he said quietly. "We prepared for the kind of battle we understood, while they invented a kind of battle we had never imagined." Yamamoto nodded and pulled out his journal, its pages yellow and worn from years of reading and rereading his own words. Over the next several weeks, American historians began interviewing Japanese officers who had survived the war. They wanted to understand how Japan had seen the conflict, what mistakes had been made, what lessons could be learned. When they came to talk with Yamamoto, he was ready with maps and charts and 3 years' worth of careful observations about American strategy. The interview took place in a small office near the ruins of the War Ministry building. Major Robert Harrison, a young intelligence officer who had fought at Iwo Jima, asked Yamamoto to explain how Japanese military leaders had viewed the American island hopping campaign. Yamamoto spread his hand-drawn maps across the table and began to talk about the greatest strategic revolution in military history. "Your island-hopping strategy gained the most while losing the least. We exhausted our strength defending positions you never intended to attack seriously. You turned our empire's size against us. Every fortified island became a fortress where our soldiers starved while you advanced past them towards victory." Major Harrison leaned forward, clearly interested. How had Japanese planners failed to anticipate this strategy? Yamamoto thought for a long moment before answering. "We thought like soldiers from the last war," he said finally. "You thought like soldiers from the next war. We believed in the power of strong positions. You believed in the power of movement and logistics." The conversation continued for hours as Yamamoto explained how American tactics had evolved during the campaign. The early landings at Guadalcanal and Tarawa had been costly frontal attacks against prepared defenses. But by 1944, American forces were bypassing the strongest positions and hitting targets that could not be reinforced quickly. Each captured island became a base for capturing the next island in a chain that led straight to Japan. "We learned too late that in modern warfare, the enemy's strength is not always where you expect to meet it. Your forces fought the Pacific War not by confronting our power directly, but by making our power irrelevant. You redrew the map of strategy itself." Major Harrison asked about the psychological effect of being bypassed and cut off. Yamamoto described the growing desperation at Rabaul as supply ships stopped coming and radio contact with Tokyo became irregular. 100,000 of our best soldiers sat in concrete bunkers, watching your bombers fly overhead towards targets we could only guess at. We were fighting a war that had already moved on without us. The most painful question came near the end of the interview. Did Japanese officers understand that they were losing the war even before the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yamamoto was quiet for several minutes before answering. By early 1945, anyone who looked at the maps could see that Japan could not win. Your bombers were burning our cities from bases we could not reach. Your submarines were sinking our supply ships faster than we could build them. Your factories were producing more planes and ships than we had lost in the entire war. After the American historians left, Yamamoto walked through the ruins of Tokyo as the sun set behind the broken skyline. American trucks rumbled past, carrying supplies to distribution centers where Japanese families lined up for food rations. The same organizational skills that had moved armies across the Pacific were now feeding a defeated nation and rebuilding its infrastructure. He stopped at a street corner where an American engineer was supervising the repair of a water main. The man worked with quiet efficiency, consulting blueprints and giving orders to Japanese workers who seemed eager to learn his methods. This was the same kind of technical competence that had built airfields on coral atolls and supplied forward bases across thousands of miles of ocean. That night, Yamamoto wrote the final entry in his war journal. The Americans succeeded because they understood something we did not. In modern war, victory belongs not to the side with the strongest defenses or the bravest soldiers, but to the side that can project power most effectively over the greatest distances. They weaponized geography itself, turning our defensive advantages into strategic liabilities. The lesson for future conflicts was clear and frightening. Any nation that tried to fight a defensive war against an enemy with superior mobility and logistics would find itself in the same position as Japan in 1945. Strong positions meant nothing if the enemy could simply go around them. Brave soldiers accomplished nothing if they were trapped in places that no longer mattered to the outcome. Yamamoto closed the journal and looked out his window at the American trucks still working through the night to bring supplies to people who had been enemies just months before. Tomorrow he would begin teaching at a small university, sharing his knowledge with young men who would someday need to understand how warfare had changed forever during those 3 years of island hopping across the Pacific. The journey from Tokyo Station to his family's temporary shelter took Yamamoto through neighborhoods that told the complete story of American strategic thinking. In Shibuya, he saw where precision bombing had destroyed only the aircraft parts factories while leaving the surrounding homes mostly intact. In Shinjuku, railway yards had been systematically demolished to cut supply lines, but the residential areas remained standing. The Americans had not bombed randomly or cruelly. They had struck exactly the targets that would cripple Japan's ability to continue fighting.
This surgical approach to destruction revealed the same methodical planning that had characterized the island-hopping campaign. Every target served a purpose in a larger strategy. Every bombing raid advanced a specific objective. The Americans had applied the same logic to aerial warfare that they had used in the Pacific. Avoid unnecessary battles, strike where the enemy was weakest, achieve maximum results with minimum waste. Walking through the Ginza district, Yamamoto encountered something that shocked him even more than the ruins. American military engineers were working alongside Japanese construction crews to rebuild a bridge over the Sumida River. The same men who had perfected the art of capturing islands were now sharing their knowledge to repair the damage their bombers had caused. Japanese workers watched carefully as Americans demonstrated new welding techniques and showed them how to use portable concrete mixers. The bridge construction site became a symbol of everything Yamamoto had learned about American character during the war. They approached reconstruction with the same systematic efficiency they had brought to conquest. Work crews arrived at precisely 7 each morning. Materials were organized and distributed according to detailed schedules. Progress was measured and recorded daily. The bridge would be finished ahead of schedule, just like the airfields at Saipan and Tinian.
At a makeshift medical clinic near the bridge, Yamamoto watched American doctors treating Japanese patients with medicines that had been flown in from bases across the Pacific. The same supply chain that had kept American forces fed and equipped during 3 years of island warfare was now bringing penicillin and morphine to former enemies. Children who had hidden in air raid shelters from American bombers were now receiving vaccinations from American medics. The contrast struck Yamamoto with physical force. During the war, Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spiritual strength over material resources. Soldiers were taught that superior fighting spirit could overcome any disadvantage in equipment or supplies. Yamamoto himself had believed that Japanese willpower would eventually triumph over American industrial capacity. But the evidence surrounding him proved how completely wrong that thinking had been. American success came not from superior courage or fighting spirit, but from superior organization and planning. They had won the war the same way they were now winning the peace, through careful preparation, efficient logistics, and relentless attention to practical details. Japanese soldiers had fought bravely and died heroically, but courage meant nothing when the enemy could bring overwhelming material advantages to bear at the time and place of their choosing. The interview with Major Harrison led to additional conversations with other American officers over the following months. Colonel James Mitchell, who had planned logistics for the Saipan invasion, wanted to understand how Japanese forces had managed to hold out for so long on bypassed islands without regular supplies. Captain William Chen, a naval intelligence specialist, asked detailed questions about Japanese submarine warfare and why it had been less effective than expected. These conversations revealed another dimension of American strategic thinking that Yamamoto had not fully appreciated during the war. The Americans had studied Japanese tactics and capabilities with the same methodical approach they brought to everything else. They knew which Japanese commanders were most dangerous, which units fought most effectively, which weapons posed the greatest threats. This intelligence had allowed them to plan their island hopping campaign with precise knowledge of what they would face at each target. Captain Chen showed Yamamoto captured Japanese documents that revealed how thoroughly American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications. Battle plans, troop movements, supply schedules, even personal messages between commanders had been intercepted and decoded. The Americans had fought much of the Pacific War knowing exactly what Japanese forces intended to do before they did it. "We thought we were fighting in secret," Yamamoto told Chen during one of their meetings. "We believed our plans were hidden from enemy eyes. But you were reading our mail and listening to our telephone calls. You knew our weaknesses better than we knew them ourselves." Chen nodded grimly and explained how signals intelligence had guided American strategy throughout the campaign. The code-breaking revelations helped explain why American forces had seemed to anticipate Japanese defensive preparations so accurately. When Japanese commanders reinforced certain islands, American planners simply chose different targets. When Japanese submarines were sent to patrol specific areas, American convoys took alternative routes. The island hopping strategy had succeeded partly because it was based on complete knowledge of Japanese capabilities and intentions. During the spring of 1947, Yamamoto began teaching military history at Waseda University, one of the few institutions that had reopened after the war. His students were young men who had been too young to fight but old enough to remember the bombing raids and the surrender announcement. They wanted to understand how Japan had been defeated so completely by an enemy they had been taught to despise. Yamamoto's lectures drew large crowds of students, faculty members, and curious civilians who packed the small classroom to hear a first-hand account of American strategy. He began each session by displaying maps that showed the progression of American forces across the Pacific, using the same charts he had maintained in his intelligence bunker at Rabaul. The visual evidence of American success was undeniable and overwhelming. The Americans redefined what it meant to win a war, he told his students during one of his memorable lectures. Traditional military thinking focused on defeating enemy armies in decisive battles. American thinking focused on destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. They attacked our supply lines, our industrial capacity, our communication networks, and our morale. By the time they reached our armies, we were already beaten.
The students asked challenging questions that forced Yamamoto to think more deeply about the lessons of the Pacific War. One young man wanted to know why Japanese military leaders had not adapted their strategy as American tactics became clear. Another asked whether Japan could have won if it had adopted island-hopping techniques first. A third wondered whether the atomic bombs had been necessary given Japan's already hopeless position. These discussions led Yamamoto to a broader understanding of what the Americans had accomplished. They had not simply invented new military tactics. They had created an entirely new approach to warfare that integrated industrial capacity, technological innovation, strategic planning, and tactical flexibility into a unified system. The island-hopping campaign was only one part of a larger revolution in how modern nations could project power across vast distances. The transformation of American military thinking during the war paralleled the transformation of American society itself. Factories that had produced automobiles were converted to build aircraft. Women who had been housewives became welders and engineers. Scientists who had studied theoretical physics were recruited to develop radar and atomic weapons. The entire nation had mobilized its resources for victory with an efficiency that Japan could not match. As months passed and reconstruction proceeded, Yamamoto began to see signs that Japan was learning from its defeat. New factories were being built using American management techniques. Universities were establishing programs in industrial engineering and operations research. Young Japanese engineers were studying American methods and adapting them to local conditions. The same capacity for learning and adaptation that had made Japan a modern nation in the late 19th century was beginning to emerge again. But the military lessons remained paramount in Yamamoto's thinking. Future wars would be won by nations that could combine technological superiority with strategic flexibility and logistical excellence. Fixed defenses would become obsolete. Mobile forces equipped with advanced weapons and supported by global supply chains would dominate future battlefields. The American model of warfare would spread to other nations and change the nature of international conflict forever. In his final journal entry, written on the second anniversary of Japan's surrender, Yamamoto reflected on the broader meaning of what he had witnessed. The Americans had demonstrated that in the modern world, victory belonged to societies that could harness their entire productive capacity for strategic purposes. Military success required not just brave soldiers and good weapons, but also efficient factories, advanced technology, skilled engineers, effective communications, and above all, the ability to coordinate complex operations across enormous distances. The island-hopping campaign had been more than a military strategy. It had been a demonstration of what an advanced industrial democracy could accomplish when it dedicated itself completely to achieving specific objectives. The same organizational skills that built the Transcontinental Railroad and the Panama Canal had been applied to conquering the Pacific Ocean. The results spoke for themselves. Japan's defeat had been inevitable not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because Japan lacked the industrial and technological foundation necessary for victory in modern warfare. The Americans had not just outfought Japan, they had outproduced, outorganized, and out-innovated their opponents. That was the real lesson of the Pacific War and the foundation for understanding all future conflicts. The Americans had not just won a war, they had invented a new way of thinking about war itself, one that made all previous military doctrines obsolete. That was their greatest victory and Japan's most important lesson for the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.